Okay, I think it's time. Let's get started here with Lecture 13, which I think puts us almost smack dab in the middle of the semester. Right, about halfway there. Today we'll talk a little bit about competition, monopoly, some of the practical aspects of monopoly policy, and then hopefully at the end of the lecture I'll talk about some strategies you might employ if you indeed wind up running a monopoly one day, right? Or if you have some market power, I should say. Before we do all that though, first there's the reading for the day. It hasn't changed from last time. Oh yes, and the most important bookkeeping thing we have to do, I guess, is figure out this exam stuff. So, same as last time, but this time I'm changing the date a little bit. I'm just pushing it back from November 4 to November 7. I'm just kind of looking at the way the lectures are timing themselves out. I'm trying to have sort of a discrete change in the nature of the material between, I guess, this is our last day. We'll have, today is the 21st. This is the last day we'll have, it's Halloween. Wow. We'll have new material of any sort. So I'm just hoping to kind of time this out, thinking about what the lectures will look like as we come down the stretch there. Anyway, so that's the new schedule. I have not yet changed the homework to reflect this, right? But the due date for all the homework should be something like, the 9th or the 10th. Maybe that Sunday night. Because I think I'll probably be grading that whole weekend. I'm kind of thinking aloud here, but okay. So, and that gives us 2.5 weeks? I think, so that should be enough time. Okay, and I think you can see if you go on to the Top Hat site and look at the materials for the class, there are now 3 homeworks up, 6, 7, and 8, that you can work on. There's going to be another one shortly, so we'll have something like 4 or 5 before the next exam. All right. Questions about any of that? I guess you can always email me about the administrative stuff. Anyways, last time we started thinking about market power, and we talked a little bit about monopoly, right, as we discussed how market power in general worked. So you might say that really what happens when a firm gets market power, right? This could be, Microsoft, it could be Apple, it could even be the coffee shop across the walkway on the other side of Lexington Avenue, right? They all to some degree have market power, more on that later. What happens when market power becomes part of a market or part of a firm's decision-making process? Well, we saw that what this does is it kind of tilts the demand curve downward sloping, right? This downward sloping demand curve suddenly introduces this distinction between marginal revenue and price, right? Before this, they had always been the same thing. In the competitive market, whenever you produce and sell another unit, what you get back is just the price. You have no control over that price. Well, with market power, you have some control over the price, and what happens is, hold on, did I start this thing? I did, okay. And what happens is you have to worry about the fact that as you produce more, you need to sell more. And if you need to sell more, you need to lower the price. Not just for that additional unit you're trying to sell, but for all of your units, right? And so this is where this distinction between price and marginal revenue comes from. So in the end, we saw that what happens, in a very well-defined way, I'll get to in a second, price winds up being too high when there's market power, and quantity winds up being too low, right? So what do we mean by too high and too low? Of course, as economists, we're very careful, thinking about comparison and counterfactuals. So I'll get to the picture, the graphical depiction of that in a second. We have a very good idea what that means, suffice it to say. Now, you might back up a step and you might say, well, market power, where does it come from? One way of thinking about where it comes from is just thinking about the assumptions we put in place to make this competitive model work, right? The homogeneous product, right? The fact that there were many sellers or a really, really, really large number of sellers, right? And this other aspect, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, freedom of entry and exit to this market, right? These things together ensured that no firm really had control over the market, right? And so we're going to talk more about this today in terms of the formal theory of monopoly, right? Which is why I expanded on it a little bit. In fact, the very last word there, barriers to entry, we will discuss extensively, as this is kind of our, thinking about why a firm has monopoly power or has this pricing power, in some ways guides the policy that we want to pursue towards this monopolist, right? If indeed we want to have any policy at all. Okay, so here was our picture. Right, I surfed the web for a good solid 20 minutes trying to find the best picture I could that depicted it. And this is kind of what I came up with here. If you look at the top, right, you'll see we have a demand curve and a marginal revenue curve below demand, right? Remember why that happened. Remember how we derived that painstakingly last time. And we saw, here we have this marginal cost curve. Of course, marginal cost and supply are the same, right? Industry marginal cost and supply are the same, at least in the comparisons we are making, right? We've been careful about that. If you remember my extended maple syrup hypothetical experiment. And so we can think about the competitive market as resting at this place where demand and marginal cost, aka supply, are the same, right? This gives us QPC and PPC right there, which stands for perfect competition. Right? That was where the red line and the blue line on my top diagram intersect. And that gives us a benchmark. Right? It says if this industry, everything else equal, were competitive, that's where it would be. That would be the price and the quantity. Right? Now, if we instead imagine that we could flick a switch and turn this industry into a monopoly, right? Remember how this was Baker taking charge of the entire maple syrup production process, and then determining how much was going to be brought to market, all by himself. That was kind of my thought experiment, strange as it was. If that were to happen, if we were to flick a switch and switch this industry from monopoly to competition, well, now we wind up with this marginal revenue, marginal cost pricing rule. Right? Marginal revenue we saw lied below demand, and so now marginal revenue equal marginal cost at this QM, right? So the monopolist will produce less. At this QM, we go up to the demand curve to figure out what the corresponding price is, and we then see that the monopolist produces QM and charges PM for the output, right? So if you compare points M, the resting point of monopoly, and PC, the resting point of competition, right? We see that we find out that the monopolist, other things equal, will produce less and sell it at a higher price than the good would be sold for in a competitive industry, right? Q lower, P higher in monopoly than in competition. Okay, so that's kind of the positive implication of the model, right? That is to say, this is just a prediction about what will happen if an industry will become monopolized. Well, we also care about the welfare aspects of this. In fact, we probably care about the welfare aspects of this more, right? And this picture kind of captures the essence pretty nicely here, right? In that when we do competition, we think about producer surplus as everything below price, get above supply, marginal cost, right? And consumer surplus is everything below demand up to the market equilibrium, yet above the price. We add those together, and that is our societal welfare deriving from this market, whatever it may be, right? Maple syrup, whatever. We add those together, and that measures total gains from exchange in our competitive market, right? So this big triangle composed of these two is societal welfare in this picture, right? Well, of course, that's kind of our benchmark, and what we want to do is compare monopoly to this case. And over here we've done that, right? So you can see here that this is kind of my, I've collapsed the picture to be just the simplest or just the critical parts. So this is kind of QM, this is QPC, and this is QM. We see that what it does, and you can see the triangles kind of labeled so you can overlay the two. What happens is the monopolist, when charging this higher price and producing this lower quantity, well, now has this blue area, right, as producer surplus, everything below that price but above supply equal marginal cost. And consumers get this green box up here, everything below demand yet above price. So you can see here we've worked out all of the various shapes here. You can see that what happens is the monopolist surrenders this aspect of consumer surplus, producer surplus, in the name of getting this aspect, right? C prime. So C prime is kind of captured from consumers, right? And you can kind of think about this as what the monopolist is trying to do. Keep price high and quantity, well, keep quantity low so price is high, and then as a result, some of the consumer surplus can be captured, right? And the problem with this, of course, is that some of the surplus is destroyed. A plus B here is lost. Deadweight loss, right? Exchanges that do not occur because the monopolist wants to keep that price high. Put another way, there's people out there willing to pay the cost of what it takes to produce those units, right? What I mean by that is their willingness to pay is above the cost of production, but they don't get produced and sold because the monopolist would say, well, to do that, I have to lower the price more than I want to, right? I will no longer be maximizing profits. So we talked about this pretty thoroughly last time, and there's some great problems I have in the problem set that help you work out some of the numerics. Hopefully, though you're starting to say, well, okay, I get it. It's just calculating areas of triangles, finding places where lines cross, and then calculating the area of rectangles and triangles, right? That's kind of what it boils down to. Once you sort of understand the logic. Okay, so now what we're going to do is maybe segue from this discussion of market power in general. You can kind of think about the diagram I just showed you to a more down in the detail-oriented discussion of what you want to do when you encounter these situations, right? We're going to leave some aspects of this aside. So when I discuss barriers to entry for a second, maybe you can say, well, there's a reason why we're not going to discuss World Cup coffee under this general umbrella of monopoly policy. And we're going to focus on monopoly with a capital M here, which I say here is the archetypal case of market power, right? And you can even think about this as, bring your sort of baggage to class and say, okay, when I understand monopolies are bad, big bad firms that are, hurting us consumers somehow. So that's kind of what we're thinking about, policy directed towards those monopolies. Right. Strangely, I've never seen anybody actually win a game of the board game of Monopoly, right? Has anybody ever played that all the way to the end? It's like 4 days of just, it takes forever. Anyways, okay, so what do we mean by a monopolist? We mean that an industry that's characterized by one big decision maker. As a practical matter, this often, melts or boils down to the typical firm controlling, 60-70% of an industry. But we're going to assume that there's really no distinction between the firm and the industry. So we talked about how previously, and I think you can see it on my diagram, marginal benefit equals price, but price is greater than marginal revenue equal marginal cost. That's kind of what's, my way of using a quick inequality system of inequalities and equalities here to describe the previous diagram. But I wanted to just sort of remind you that there's this other aspect to this as well, which is going to concern us, which really focuses in on this idea of barriers to entry. Right? That in a competitive market, firm entry drives this other aspect of efficiency, right? It drives the market price down to minimum of average cost. In fact, I regret not writing min AC here, right? And so this entry is kind of, I sort of think about it this way, the day-to-day pricing aspect of monopoly is kind of the short-run problem. The long-run problem is there is no impetus to push the industry towards this minimum of AC. So what I'm going to do is just think about just remind you, oops, my slide is kind of going off the thing here. Just remind you how this worked in terms of our diagram that we drew like this, and remind you that it's kind of, what happens is this, it's sort of like a shift in supply, and as a practical matter, what happens is this supply gets shifted out to the minimum of average cost, right? It always shifts out and finds its way to the price where this is at its minimum, right? That's kind of the mechanical what happens here just on the diagrams. in the long run, the supply curve will always find that P3 on my diagram. And it's a little bit tough to, understand that or see that on this diagram. So what do we do when we're in these situations as economists? Or what do I do? Well, I'll explain it in a second here. Usually what you want to do is you want to say, how can I make my model, as simple as it possibly can be, right? So that when I explain what the basic problem is, my students in Eco 100 will see it, right? Of course, we do this as a professional matter too. You often, you write a paper, what you want to do is you want to say, well, let's start off with paragraph 1, this is the subject, paragraph 2, here's a very simple example to show you what I'm thinking about, right? And so in some ways what we might want to do is think about an even simpler way of doing this. So I'm going to introduce another diagram in a second that'll hopefully capture this idea. And we'll use this diagram going forward. It's going to be the center of many of our exciting discussions. Anyways, so how would we think about this in the monopolist in the long run? Well, really here's the big lesson, is that this picture applies both in the short run and the long run for a monopolist, right? There's no change in supply or marginal cost here for the monopolist because there's no entry, right? That was the thing that was shifting around the industry supply in competition, but here the firm is the industry, so they're the same thing, and we can sort of think about, all right, well, the monopolist will charge this price, will produce this amount, MC equal MR, go up there and get the price, and boom, that's both the short run and the long run. The implication is that over the long haul, the monopolist makes profits. It's a little hard to compare, right? It's hard to sort of, you can do this when you take Eco 200 or Eco 300, principles of micro, intermediate micro. So what I'm going to do is just show you a simpler diagram which hopefully gets the idea across. Once again, we do this all the time. We try to capture the principle in the simplest possible way. And so this will be the first appearance in this class of the completely flat marginal cost curve. Well, maybe the second appearance. We had we talked about it a little bit when I was talking about my economics lessons. But we're just going to suppose marginal cost is flat and is the same as average cost, right? So what is the gist of this simplifying assumption? So you remember when I was talking about oil rigs and all that stuff where there was a fixed cost, you would pay it, and then you would start producing, and over time, as you produce more and more, your marginal costs would go up and up. We're saying, okay, well that's great. This detailed understanding of costs and where they come from and how they work in the short and long run is interesting, but we don't really need it here to reflect the basic idea we're trying to get across. So what we're going to do is just assume that average costs and marginal costs are the same and constant. What does that mean? Well, if we're thinking about coffee or maple syrup, it means our industry is characterized by a situation where anyone, in a competitive world anyway, can produce a unit of maple syrup, say, at $3 a bottle. It doesn't matter that $3 applies to the first unit, to the 1,000th unit, to a new firm entering. When the firm is producing 10 or 20 or 200 units, $3 a bottle always, right? So it's just a flat line at this $3. That's going to be our marginal cost curve. I mean, that's, of course, not realistic, at least in terms of the job we've done building up cost theory, but you'll see it makes understanding this behavior of a monopolist, both in terms of the short run and the long run, much simpler. Although we will lose some information here. So, of course, on my slide I use grilled cheese, $2 to make for everyone, right? Whether it's the first or the 10,000th. So it looks a little bit like this. Now this is a great diagram. It's really simple. And believe it or not, in a couple of classes we're going to deploy it to understand a big lawsuit that happened in this country, the US versus Microsoft. Right? And we're also going to use this diagram to understand the behavior of retail giants like Costco and some retail giants of the past. Anyways, how does it work here? Well, here's my marginal cost equal average cost line. It's this red line, right? Just flat right there. And that could be the $2 from my previous slide, right? If the costs are constant, well, wherever you are here, they're just right there, $2, right? And they're the same as average cost. Uh-oh. It's kind of astonishing I haven't done that before. I think we're still going strong here, right? Okay. So this becomes really simple in thinking about a competitive market, right? We see that the competitive market, if we treat this MC as supply, well, supply and demand is this point here, right? It's just right there. That's all. I mean, the industry becomes a little bit dry if you want to talk about how many producers there are in the industry and how many grilled cheese sandwiches or maple syrup bottles each is producing. You really have no information about that from this diagram. But you can at least see in the end what it will look like. You can say, well, at this point, price is equal to average cost, or minimum average cost, which, with this flat line is trivial, right? It's everywhere. The minimum is everywhere along the line. Price is equal to marginal cost is equal to average cost. Nobody's making any profits, right? And we see that, the price will reflect this minimum average cost and marginal cost. As a consequence, there's no producer surplus, right? Right? There's no cheaply produced unit that gets the going market price, right, as the costs go up. There's no upward sloping supply. So we just have this line, there's zero producer surplus here. And as a consequence, we can just look at this triangle up there and see that that's consumer surplus, right? The entire purplish blue shaded area, right? And so that's a description of our industry in the short run and in the long run. Fair enough? And maybe you can see some of these other things. You see that the consequences of price, marginal cost, and supply being the same. You see the free entry because price will, anybody can produce this as average cost. If price were anywhere above that, people would just flood into the industry and make profits. So price is forced down to this line somehow. Well, over here, we can see what happens in the monopoly situation in maybe the simplest possible fashion, right? Where we now have added this marginal revenue curve, which is below demand, and marginal revenue equal marginal cost is still the rule we want to apply, right? We find marginal revenue equal marginal cost, go up there and we get the monopoly price. Now, for those of you who, we used to have to calculate triangles and rectangles and add them together to figure out all the surpluses, we can really do it in an even simpler fashion here. So you can see the producer surplus is just this box, right? Because the price is PM, the difference between PM and MC, or AC, I should say price, right? PM and cost, right, is there, and that's our producer surplus. So you might think about this as below price, above supply, right? The difference between price and costs at the determined price. So there's our producer surplus. You can see our consumer surplus up top, and now our deadweight loss is just an even simpler triangle here, right? But you can see what the monopolist does. It reduces production to get some of the consumer surplus. It's very clear in this diagram, right? And all the areas are very simple to calculate. Deadweight loss, producer surplus / profit, and consumer surplus, right? And of course, one of the things I like about this diagram is you can look at it and you can kind of say, all right, it applies both in the short run and the long run. You can sort of see the minimum average cost thing going on. The price equal marginal cost equal demand, equal marginal benefit in the competitive case. And you can see all the stuff we talked about in the monopoly case. So you can sort of compare these two. And we're actually going to use this diagram to think about entry in a couple of classes. So I did have a numerical example. I think I've been kind of yapping too much, so maybe I'll just, you know what, I'll do it out. It'll get you used to the diagram, and it's one of these things. If you probably do the example out here. So I have the note to self, MC equal 2, price equal 10. Okay. So what I'm doing here is I gave myself some quick instructions on the slide to draw a diagram where I know I'll turn off the slide in a second. Kind of looks like this. Here's 2, here's P, here's Q, Here's 10. We have this. I've said that this line here is, this point here is 100, this is 80, and then we have a marginal revenue there, and this is 40, and this is 6, right? And really the key thing about this calculation will be that it's pretty simple to do and show you all of the things that we've been talking about. Okay, so in the competitive industry, right, here we have, I should always label my curves, here's demand, here's marginal cost equals supply, right? And at a price of $2, which is also the marginal cost, is also the average cost, we see what happens is, let me just pull this back a little bit, we see that what happens is cross at this point, and so we want to figure out consumer surplus in the competitive industry. Well, let's see, this distance is 8, this is 80, so the area of this triangle is 8 times 80 is 640 divided by 2. So in the PC world, we have consumer surplus is equal to 320. Producer surplus is equal to 0, right? So that's the competitive world. And maybe that would be, I can just shade this whole thing like this. That's consumer surplus. Now in the monopoly world, well, here's marginal revenue. Here's marginal revenue equal marginal cost, supply as we've been understanding such things. We go up here and we find that the price is 6. So consumer surplus then is this area up here. Producer surplus is this area down here. And this then is our deadweight loss here, right? So we can figure out consumer surplus. How am I doing with space there? Let's see, 10 minus 6 is 4 times 40. So this triangle up here is an area of 4 times 40 divided by 2. 4 times 40 is 1,680, thank you. Producer surplus is this area here, 4 times 40. But it's a rectangle, so you don't have to divide by 2, it's 160. And we can add those together to get total surplus, which would be 240. So you can see here in the competitive world, total surplus is 320. In the monopoly world, total surplus is 240. Well, that would seem to indicate that this triangle here, the deadweight loss due to monopoly, is 80, right? Okay. So that just helps, look how quickly and easily we saw all the, we were able to calculate all of these things in this simplified example. So, okay. And I think I have a problem like this on the problem sets for you to work through. Okay, so what is all this? It's a description of the social problem, right? Both the short run and the long run problem in monopoly, right? You could think about this as the problem with market power. The pricing problem is part of this, but so is this barrier to entry cause, right? Or this barrier to entry problem, right? So we've sort of decided, my first bullet point is that it looks like there are social costs to monopoly or deadweight losses that accrue to monopoly, right? So it's interesting that what has happened with policy, we have a wide variety of policies across the the economy that deal with monopoly. So one obvious solution to this problem, like if we now know that it is a problem, is to say, well, if there's a monopoly, maybe we can break it up, right? So instead of having one big firm, right, we'll have many small firms, and that will approximate better a competitive industry, right? I like the way I just said that because that's what we're trying to do, right, is make our industry look like a competitive one, is maybe the ultimate aim here. Sometimes, however, and that's antitrust policy, more on that in a second. Sometimes, however, and you'll learn more about this in your upper level micro courses, there are these things we call natural monopoly. And that's where there's just this situation in which being big is just a natural advantage for society, in that it avoids things like duplication of effort and all of that, right? And so I have some examples that I'll talk about in a second of that situation. And we'll see that the approach then might be different. Right? Why does this happen? I'll talk about that in a second. In those cases, we let the monopoly exist, but then regulate its price. And we'll hopefully be able to see why that's good. In any way we sort of attack this monopoly problem, it's important to know that these solutions are not perfect. And I'll reflect a little bit on some of the problems that we run into when we do this. We have some other situations which sit outside the model, one of which is the relationship between monopoly and innovation, right? Development of new technologies. And we'll circle back to this later in course when we talk about economic growth and why it happens. Schumpeter, that's a famous economist who's known for describing a theory of creative destruction and growth, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And there are these questions about whether or not monopolies engage in more research and development than competitive firms. So none of that, of course, is in our competitive or even our market power-based model yet. So we'll have to introduce some other tools to understand those situations. They're coming soon. Okay, so part of this policy issue, thinking about how we're going to attack monopoly as whether or not it's a good thing, or how to make it a better thing for society, is we have to sort of understand where the barrier to entry is coming from, right? What is keeping firms from entering the industry, and why is it a monopoly? So oftentimes, and just to kind of go down the list here, you might think about the way you would treat this policy or treat the monopoly. It'll vary based on exactly how you feel the monopoly has come into being. So it might be the case that a monopolist has come into being because they own a critical natural resource, right? So this might be something like, like De Beers, and diamonds or something like that. Or maybe, less sort of maybe more innocuously, you might say, like if somebody owns the only hill in town and therefore has a monopoly on providing a ski area, something like that. Maybe it's because there's some critical technology out there that this firm has that no one else has, right? That's kind of what's going on with the software company, and it's kind of what happened with Kodak in the early part of the century, right? They got far ahead of everybody else in developing film. But then there's also these natural monopolies, I'll say, that arise just because it's naturally efficient to be very large, and if you were to try to compete with any one of these firms, you'd have to also be very large. So a good example is the power company, and what I sort of have in mind here is that, well, you have to have this giant thing that makes power, that makes electricity, say, but then you also have to have these means of distribution, like electric wires. And so if we wanted to have rival power companies out there, we would need parallel sets of power lines going everywhere, right? And that doesn't seem so efficient. It seems like there's good reasons for just having one company and one set of power lines handling everything, right? The same is true, I guess, of cable television, though it's an interesting industry, right? One thing we'll talk about is oftentimes these monopolies create a lot of innovation in and of themselves because people are sort of dissatisfied with them, right? Cable might be an example. The MTA is a monopoly, right? And you can sort of apply the same arguments there, right? You need trains and all this stuff and tracks. If you wanted to have competition in the public transit game, it's a little bit difficult, right? Because you need to technically have parallel tracks. In fact, I've linked this little article here. And everybody should know a little bit about the New York City, the history of the subway. And if you look at this article, let me go back. You'll see that it originally started out with a couple of competing subway lines, right? So there were letters and numbers, and they were different companies, right? And so my son, today we were, for various reasons, we had to go into school. We took some of the letter trains instead of the usual number trains, and the result was we had to kind of walk underground in Union Square for a while, all that stuff. And he's like, why do they do this? Why didn't they better coordinate it? And I was thinking, well, it's because it developed, back in the day when there was competition between subway companies, and then they brought them together later, so there still are these historical, vestiges of what the system looked like. I think I started to say that, and then he quickly lost interest and was like, "Shut up, Dad," So there's that situation as well. But notice that at times we actually create barriers to entry as a government, right? So one example of this is that we do have this system of government licensing, which conveys some degree of market power or monopoly power to involved parties. More on that in a second. We also have this thing called the patent or copyright system, right, which creates natural monopolies as well. So, for example, Pfizer develops a new drug, right? It gets a patent, right, which then gives it a monopoly right to produce and sell that drug. Okay. And of course there are even more nefarious examples where the barrier to entry is intimidation and violence. And this was an article I discovered years ago, which is kind of a fun example of a barrier to entry. And it talks a little bit about the so-called Bronx lobster industry, right? And it talks a little bit about how a certain fisherman here, to let people know, well, guess what happens to me could happen to you, and he's sort of saying, well, don't mess around with lobster pots in my Bronx lobster fishery. So you may be surprised to learn that there are in fact lobsters in the Bronx River, right, East River area, and there's a little fishery there. And this was years ago, so I'm curious if it's 30 years ago now, right? So I'm wondering if this still holds up. The point is that sometimes you can protect entry, and entry barrier is violence, right, or the threat of force. Okay. So in each of these cases, right, you might say that because of that there's various issues that we're trying to address here when we have monopoly policy, and it's important to sort of think about that and maybe put it side to side next to the formal theory of monopoly that we've talked about, right? And so you might think about these different policy approaches as involving issues that, different issues that might emerge from our model, right? But they also might emerge for reasons that have nothing to do with our model, right? Things we haven't really talked about yet. And it's a nice example. It's a nice place for me to sort of get you used to thinking about these sort of things. So, government licensing and quality. This conveys market power, but we often think about there as being this corresponding benefit, right? Which is that there is, you can certify if you require licensing, you require that anybody producing a good provides it at a certain quality, a certain skill level, has certain credentials, all of those things, right? So there's if you ever want to do some research on medical history, that's one of my favorite subjects, right? The economics and related issues of historical health. You can go back in time and look at the American Medical Association and how it came into existence and how we got this whole system of doctor licensing and all of that. Because if you go back far enough, basically anybody could be a doctor, right? You could just slap your shingle outside and, I'm a doctor, come on in, and what's wrong with you? I'll tell you. And that world was a little complicated, so we have some regulation that keeps people from, or that ensures that if you walk into a doctor's office, the person has some idea what they're doing. They've been to a medical school. But there are problems with this. So you get some situations where, when you create market power, you invite people to kind of maybe do more than, this comes from both sides, I guess. Some people who maybe will create this barrier to entry or enforce it in a way that maybe you didn't want to. I'll put it that way. So here we have this, rather interesting article you can look at on, some of the unintended consequences, I'll say, of our regulations in the city, right, involving enforcement of the fact that you need a vending license to sell food. So there's that. And then there's also these excesses, right, that have to do with, sometimes these requirements, right, that are put in place maybe aren't ensuring quality in the way you think. Maybe there's an established interest in the industry that's trying to protect or restrict entry for some other reason, right? And this is an interesting example about, I guess years ago there was this requirement that if you were going to do something like hair braiding, you needed to have a full set of credentials in hairdressing, which is it's a little hard to understand, but I'll let you reach your own conclusions on that. Now, with government patents and copyrights, we think about the trade-off as a little bit different, right? The idea is you have this policy put in place, and the monopoly profits themselves give people incentives to innovate, right? And so what you try to do, if you're an innovator, is you try to create a brand new product or a new process or a new way of doing something, and then you get a right, an exclusive right to sell that product or to produce with that particular technology. Now, eventually, what happens, right, is your patent runs out and your innovation falls into the public domain, right? And then everybody can use it. So what we're trying to do as a government is balance the incentives for people to create new things, right, new drugs or whatever, using the patent system, but also allow that in the end these things fall into the public domain and then everybody can use them. So you can think about this as trying to strike a balance between the competitive model where there's free entry and the monopoly model where there isn't, so that people create new inventions. Now, this applies not only to things like drugs and production processes, but also copyright, which one thing I like to do is every year I go to look at this site here, Public Domain Day, right? And this documents for us all the works of art, creative work that was previously protected by copyright, but has now fallen into the public domain, right? And so famously in this last year, the original Mickey Mouse from Steamboat Willie is now in the public domain, right? Meaning that anybody can use the image, likeness as they liked. Prior to that, it was the intellectual property of Disney. Now, Lady Chatterley's Lover and Charlie Chaplin are all here. Good stuff. You might notice that a lot of this stuff is kind of old, right? And indeed, the copyright legislation has now evolved to the point at which if you create a piece of artistic work, your copyright protection extends for your life plus 75 years, I believe, right? So that's a long time. And you might wonder why it's so long, if that's the optimal situation. I think about this all the time. What would happen if copyright were shorter? Do we even need copyright? So on and so forth. I've written some papers on it as well. So it's funny, one thing, I'll say this, it's a little bit of a digression, but it's also interesting that as a kid when I was I used to like science fiction, and I liked in particular fantasy, and I didn't know this at the time, but one of the first, I think maybe the first fantasy book, I think the earliest fantasy that most people in this class might encounter would be maybe Lord of the Rings, but Conan the Barbarian was written in the 20s and 30s, before the Lord of the Rings. And it really is great fantasy. It was written by this guy named Ron Howard, right, who very tragically killed himself when he was in his early 30s. It's hard to believe he could have written this fantasy. It's really that good, the early Conan books. But as a consequence, Conan fell into the public domain much earlier than a lot of other things, and so we got some Hollywood movies and Conan comic books and all of these add-on pieces of intellectual property. But the original Conan novels, they used to be in this magazine called Weird Tales, I think it was. Strange Tales? Weird Tales. They're terrific fantasy writing. I didn't know it at the time. It's also some of the first fantasy writing. So there are some issues there. Now, there's also this argument about just size being efficient, and I've alluded to this when I've mentioned the MTA and the power companies and all of that. And so in this case, right, it's just natural that there will be one big firm. And what we often try to do as a government is we try to regulate the price, right, that these firms face. That is to say, by legislation, we say you can charge this for your product. and we try to get this price as close as possible to, I guess, the marginal cost and average cost of production, right? So the idea is, instead of letting the monopolist slide up and down on this curve, right, we try to pass a law that just fixes the monopolist's price right at this marginal cost equal average cost line, right? And that way we effectively say, you can't change your price. Every time you produce a unit, all you're getting is that price. Now you'll behave like a competitive firm because you're not controlling price, right? So that's the logic there. And of course, it's not a perfect policy. Hopefully you can appreciate the principle, but hopefully you can also sort of intuit that, like anything, the practical aspects are often a little bit more difficult than you would think. All you have to do is, every time the MTA wants to hike the fares, the argument is almost the same, right? It's, we can't, our price isn't high enough, we're losing money, and then people say, no, the price is too high. But hopefully you can appreciate the logic, right? Is that we're trying to set price so that firms behave like they're competitive, while at the same time getting the advantages of just having this one large firm, right? So you think about that as the price regulation in these instances. Well, saving the best for the most interesting, I guess, or maybe not, but one of the most interesting aspects of monopoly for last here, it's our body of antitrust law, which has developed since the late 1800s up until the present, right? In fact, the seminal moment was the Sherman Act of 1890, right, which said that using monopoly power to exploit consumers was illegal, right? And indeed, in that period of time, you don't have to, you walk outside and walk around New York, all the names are right there, right? Carnegie, Rockefeller, these are the big, I guess, I was going to say robber barons, but I'll just say the big, could say monopolists, right? Entrepreneurs, I don't know. Whatever you want to say, those are the big names associated with this movement, right? They monopolized entire industries and became fabulously rich doing so, right? So Standard Oil, that was Rockefeller's system, or Rockefeller's firm, right? And it made him the richest man in the world for, a good solid 30 years. We're going to talk about how rich when we learn a little bit about inflation and all that stuff. Like, who is richer, Jeff Bezos or John D. Rockefeller, right? Interesting question. But anyway, he created this behemoth, Standard Oil. And it was basically both an oil production company, but also a distribution company. So at the time there were railroads, right? And that was the only way to really get stuff around the country. And he controlled kind of both aspects. And so, they were sued by the government under the Sherman Act, Standard Oil was. In the end, 1911, Standard Oil was broken up into 34 separate companies, right, that had kind of their regional focuses, which, in the end grew into some of the oil companies that you think about now, like Exxon and BP and stuff like that, right? So that was one monopoly that kind of came and went due to legislation. Another famous one, U.S. Steel, right? This was what, Carnegie? Carnegie started it, and then J.P. Morgan Chase, took his financial acumen and power and built it into U.S. Steel, the monopolist, right? This one didn't go away because of legislation. It just turned out that it was eventually outcompeted by another rival firm that came along, Bethlehem Steel. Some other firms were a little bit quicker to innovate and all of that stuff. I mention this because, we'll see that this is actually a recurring theme. Kodak, right, came along and started up, as photography became a big thing, produced its own cameras, but also made a lot of film. What it was also doing, there were independent filmmakers all over there. People who made, not filmmakers like movies, but people who made photographic film, little businesses. Kodak began buying them up, or also just buying their output and reselling it under the Kodak name, so much so that it controlled about 80% of the industry at one point in the by 1921, I guess. So what eventually happened was they were stopped from doing that by a so-called consent decree, right? Which meant it was basically said, you know what, we're going to find you guilty of something, so you better just agree to this, get out of that business, stop buying up all the little firms, and stop selling other film under your name, right? So that might sound familiar to you, right? People always accuse, say, Facebook of doing this, right? Buying up any independent software company that comes along. One thing that happened in my lifetime was pretty interesting. Was AT&T was a national American telephone and telegraph. It was basically a national phone network, right? Landlines and all that. That was deemed to be a monopoly, and so it was broken up into the so-called baby bells, right? Named after Bell telephone, which were. Let me just see here. I think I have a link here. These were the baby bells here. So I remember SNET, Southern New England Telephone. That was my local baby bell, and of course this encouraged competition in the long distance market in particular. So I still remember that. Like there was when I was a kid. It sounds crazy, but you used to like wait till after 5 o'clock to make long distance calls. So we would all sit around, and my mom would be like, "Matt, come here. We're calling your grandparents." 5:05. So that encouraged long distance competition, which actually I think it did a fair to middling job. I have to read up on that one a little bit. More recently, in the 90s, Microsoft was sued for being a monopolist, right? And the argument was that it was this operating system that had a monopoly in making and selling its operating system, right, in the 90s. So this was at a time, you're probably all saying, Microsoft, I like to use a Mac. Well, at the time, the Macs had kind of bottomed out, right? Apple was in pretty bad shape. And so Microsoft controlled most of the operating system market. And they also faced this related issue that they had integrated Microsoft Explorer into the operating system, and the argument was that if you tried to remove it, bad things would happen, and so this was a big issue at court. Microsoft actually lost their monopoly lawsuit, but won it on appeal, so they were under very real threat of being broken up into different companies. They won on appeal, but made this concession as a result that they weren't going to integrate their browser as closely to the rest of the whole system. Right? It's kind of funny though, because I was sort of, as I was doing this, making my slides on Google Slides, I was thinking, well, Google, my kids, they have Chromebooks and all that stuff, they've kind of integrated, the other way around, right? The browser is sort of the operating system. It's all integrated on Google. And so we're actually going to, when we talk about the next section in class and we talk a little bit about strategic behavior, we're going to take a look at one of Microsoft's arguments that it made in court, and it's really kind of an interesting use of that linear ACMC model, right? The flat line ACMC model. Something very much like that Microsoft applied in a particular fashion in their own defense. So, okay, well, let me just... Going forward, though, just to wrap this up and then to dive into the what should you do if you're a monopolist discussion. Going forward, we do have these ongoing debates, and whenever I think about market power and all that stuff, the one debate that seems to pop up all the time is this notion of price gouging, right? In that firms they use market power and gouge you, right? And it's kind of this interesting philosophical discussion that people have been having for a long time, armed with a little bit of the supply and demand tools that you know now. Hopefully you can think about it on your own. Should businesses raise prices during a crisis? I don't know. I mean, it kind of seems like it happens, right? You can think about, in a crisis, the demand for bottled water, say, skyrockets. Well, we know that should move us up a supply curve and create a higher price. Is that gouging? I don't know. And so I think about this a lot in the context of, nowadays people get very upset about oil prices or gasoline prices. And maybe what I'll do is I'll bring you down to my third arrow point there, the counterfactual. It's what would it look like in a world in which you did something about the prices of gasoline, say, when they seem to be going too high. Well, this in fact happened in the early 70s. I don't remember it, but I remember people talking about it years later. And we had the so-called odd-even rationing system, right? couple people know what I'm talking about here, right? And so what happened was, the gas prices were too high, so we tried to fix them at a certain amount. But then, of course, there was a shortage because the price ceiling was in place, right? And so then what they had to do was say, well, what we're going to do is figure out who gets the short supplied units. And the idea was that if your license plate on your car ended with an odd number, you could get gas on an odd numbered day. And if it ended with an even number, you could go pump gas on an even numbered day, right? And so that was the odd-even rationing system in place. That wasn't great. Was it that much better than letting the price fluctuate? I don't know. But once again, think about your counterfactual. What happens with, what happens without? What does it look like when we try to do something about price gouging? So the what is a crisis link lets you take a look at that. Yeah?
Remember when baby formula was like, you can get your hands on?
There's the baby formula crunch. I forgot about that. Yeah, was that price gouging? Was that one? So I don't know. I mean, I guess what I'm saying here is, every now and then as a professor, you like to say, you know what, I don't have all the answers. And there's a lot of great questions for you to think about. I don't know what to make of this. And in fact, this debate has been going on for, if not hundreds of years, thousands of years. In my history of thought class, I talk about, back in medieval times, when really the only institution in Western Europe anyways was the church. Most of the economic theory that was going on at the time had this sort of religious aspect to it. And that was a big question, was just price. What is a fair price to charge for your product and still be a good, religious Christian? Right? Can you charge a markup? What if something's scarce? What do you do then? And it's in some ways it's kind of the same question. It's been with us for a long time. So anyway, more recently, so I leave a little bit of time left for the last thing I want to talk about. There are these recent antitrust controversies, right? And here's something very different is happening. Right? Because it's not about this idea that monopolists are restricting quantity to get higher prices. Indeed, it's hard to sort of think about what Meta and Google are actually doing with this in the context of this old model, right? This, I guess you could say, classic monopoly model. Because they aren't really selling output at a price, but they are monopolizing something, right? And, if you are to sort of sneak your way, if you're going to become an economist one day and take the higher level classes, by the way, all of this stuff on antitrust is and some other stuff I'll talk about, we treat in what we call an industrial organization class. There are mysteries, right? And there are things that we're trying to think about, but we don't really have, I don't have a consensus model of what Meta and Google are doing to show you. We'll be able to touch on it a little bit once we think about strategic behavior, but suffice it to say, they don't seem to be like traditional monopolies. Now there's this further complication that a lot of the goods we consume today have this network or two-sided market quality to them, right? That is to say, you're a buyer of something while at the same time you're a consumer of something, right? So, maybe you watch a YouTube video, you're consuming something, but by the same token, YouTube is selling you, your eyeballs, to a firm, right? Advertising. So in some ways, we call this a two-sided market. So I had a little, with a colleague here, we had a little bit of a foray into this field, and we studied this question about local television news and whether or not it was efficiently provided. And what we tried to do in this research project was think about all these things. Like advertisers want certain sorts of eyeballs, they provide certain sorts of programming to get those eyeballs, they charge certain rates for these programs to advertisers. Do we wind up getting the right amount of television news? May seem like a weird question, but people are worried about these issues today, especially as a lot of local news outlets go out of business, things like that. Okay, well, one other aspect that I'm going to talk about later, I don't have much else to say about this, for better or for worse, is we are going to talk about retail monopolies, right? Which are interesting because they behave in a very different fashion than the classic, U.S. Steel. I'm talking about Amazon, firms like that, right? What they do is they dominate industries by just selling things at a really, really, really low price, right? And we have a really long and fascinating history with these retail monopolies in the United States. And it's it goes in some surprising and interesting directions, and I love to talk about it. So I'm dying to mention what these monopolies are that I'm going to talk about, but I'm saving it, right? Because it's a lot of fun to talk about. We'll discuss that. Okay. So I have a couple minutes here. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the things that, if you are indeed a monopolist, I guess you can think about these in one of two ways. If you're a policymaker and you're worried about monopoly, you might look out for this stuff. But also, if you get in a situation where you're a business owner, maybe these are strategies you might use to maximize your own profits. So one extension that's interesting is price discrimination. So what is price discrimination, and what does it do to our model? Well, this is a situation where you can charge different prices for different people, different consumers, right? So as a practical matter, what you do is you look at your consumer, you figure something out about them, and then you tailor a price to that consumer. So oftentimes the way this works is you can set a really high price for your product and then say, well, inquire within, discuss with us, maybe we'll work something out for you, right? So maybe the leading example, yeah?
Is insurance the price discrimination?
Oh, well, that's interesting. Insurance. Boy, that's a tough one. That's a great question. Is insurance price discrimination? I guess you kind of could say it is, but there's also this complicated issue that you're charged higher or lower insurance rates for reasons of risk and all of that stuff. So it's probably a blend of two, right? There's some legitimate reasons for charging different rates, but there's also probably some price discrimination as we know it going on there, right? And in fact, there's also this problem, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later in class, called moral hazard and adverse. We call it moral hazard and adverse selection. These are informational problems. They occur because A, you might have some reason to misrepresent yourself, right? You might say, for example, that you're a very safe driver, or you're very healthy, right, to get a good insurance rate, but that might not be the case. We call that adverse selection. Moral hazard is when you change the way you behave because you're insured, right? So if you have insurance, maybe you're more careless than you otherwise would be, right? Anyways, good questions. Yeah. So just going back to the pure price discrimination case, college tuition is a pretty good example of this, where you apply to college and you apply for financial aid, then they rake you over the coals, all your financial records, and then they say, we know it says $90,000 to go to college here for a year. We'll charge you $40,000 because that's your income and all of that stuff. So they try to find a price point that matches what you have here. So there's local gyms in my area that do this as well, right? Where if you search the web, you'll never find a price anywhere. They'll say, come talk to us about a membership, right? And intuitively, what they're trying to do is find a price that you'll pay, right? Price discriminate a little bit. So you get the point with these other things. One last point I'll mention here: auto dealerships, fast passes. By the way, you try to discriminate among consumers who will pay more to avoid lines, at an amusement park. Auto dealerships used to do a lot of this, right? But it's a lot harder now because, when you're buying a car, you just look up what the price is online. You don't just walk in and sort of start talking to the used car salesman who tries to figure out how much they can get out of you, right? But mainly the chief analytical consequence of all this is marginal revenue does not decrease faster than price, right? So put another way, I'll show you here in a slide. If you think about my economics lesson example from a couple classes ago, it would go something like this, right? And I think I slid it in there. I said, well, imagine what would happen if I posted my little phone number tag pull thing on the telephone pole outside of my building, economics lessons, and I said price, inquire within, right? What I might try to do when someone called up and asked for licenses or lessons is I might say, well, let's see, who do I have here? Oh, I see it. I have a retired entrepreneur who made millions and millions of dollars. I think they'll pay $100, right? I'll charge them $100 for a 1-hour lesson, right? A college student, right, comes and says, well, I need help with my economics class. I say, well, college student, they probably don't have a lot of money. I'll charge them something like 60, right? So I can tailor the price to the person I'm actually going to teach. And in this instance, what I will do is I will charge each consumer as close to their willingness to pay as I possibly can, right? So I charge the first customer 100, the second 80, and the third 60. Now, if you remember what happened when I had to charge a fixed price for everyone, I wound up stopping at 2 lessons, right? Because I didn't want to lower my price to 60 to attract that third student, or that third unit of demand. I'll let you go back and look at the video to see how we did that. But now, of course, notice that I'm just basically comparing the willingness to pays to my costs of providing the lesson. The first person, I'm psyched about that. I get 100 minus 50 is what I realize from providing that lesson. 80 minus 50 is what I get from my second. 60 minus 50 is what I get from the third, if I can tailor the price to each person. So this is kind of what's going on, right? You can see that what I'm doing is I'm charging these prices for different customers. See this first diagram up here has a high price for people with a high willingness to pay. If I could charge that price to everybody above P high, if I could figure out who they are somehow, I would do it. And then I would charge a lower price for other customers. Well, if I could charge high, medium, and low prices to different people along the demand curve, I would do that. In the end, right, I'll charge a price for an individual price for each person along this demand curve. And you see what happens. I wind up capturing all of the consumer surplus by discriminating for price here. So it's a little bit of a dilemma because you can see I will produce up to price equal marginal cost, but what I do is I charge a price that sort of captures all of the consumer surplus. So what does that mean for societal welfare? Interesting. If you can do it though, you know.
Isn't that what airline companies do?
Oh yes, airlines, of course. Yes. So, and maybe that's a good way to say this. If you can do this, you will, and that's why we see so much of it across the economy. Right now, you sort of understand what's going on here. I'm not going to test you on that, but it's just kind of a point of interest. So one way of thinking about what happens here is this picture no longer applies. Right? You remember our red-blue comparison. When we dropped the price, we lost that red rectangle. Now we don't lose the red rectangle, we just gain the blue, right? Because we're not lowering the price of the previous units. So by that logic, we just wind up with marginal revenue being equal to demand again, and we go all the way out on our curve. Quickly, last thing here. If you happen to be a monopolist, we have a variety of so-called markup formulas you can use to figure out what the profit maximizing price of your product should be. What is a markup? Well, it's the difference between the price and the marginal cost. And so what you do is you say, well, the cost of producing this unit costs me this. I'm going to add something to that cost, and then that'll be my price. And you can use some simple rules of thumb. You can say, I'll double the marginal cost, that'll be my price. How do you determine that? Well, usually it has to do, maybe the takeaway here, I'm running out of time, is that this is about the elasticity, right? And that is to say about how steep or flat, roughly speaking, the demand curve is. So the way we calculate this out in your typical class, this is more, we're not going to have to do this in this class, but it's an advertisement for Eco 200 and 300. You learn how to do this. You can calculate the elasticity if you have some idea what percentage change in Q corresponds with what percentage change in P, right? The elasticity is just the ratio of those things. So if I raise prices by a certain amount, if I raise prices by 10%, what happens to quantity demanded? By what percentage does that increase? So elasticity of -2, for example, would mean a 10% increase in price, right? Or a 10% decrease in price will result in a 20% increase in demand. right? That gives me -2 because one goes up, the other goes down, right? Demand curve slopes down. An elasticity of 1.5 means if I raise my price by, let's see, 10%, or if I lower my price by 10%, quantity demanded will go up by 15%, right? So you can use these elasticities in a formula like this, which you will derive in your Eco 200 or 300 class, to figure out how to mark up your product, right? So plug in -2. -2 divided by 1 plus -2 gives -2 divided by -1, which becomes 2. So if this is your elasticity, double your marginal cost, that's your best price. If this is your elasticity, triple your marginal cost, get your price. So I'll let you work that one out. One thing you'll see here is the formula breaks down if E is less than 1. If you're ever selling your product in this range, right, where the percentage change in Q is less than the percentage change in P, you're throwing money away. Never do that, right? That's another thing that you learn from this. Anyways, I'll stop it there. I won't ask you about any of these things on a test, but it's fun to sort of have them in your repertoire.